You going? And welcome back. Hey, wait a sec. Did that not change? It was supposed to change. I told it to change the title. Hold on, we're gonna stop. We'll be right. Take two.
Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
I should have updated the title. There we go. All right. Title was not updating for me there. Hey, Paula. Evening, Kathy. Evening, Robin, Kathleen, and Susan. Warm in here today. Hey, Geraldine. Hey, Debbie. Hey, Betsy. Evening, everybody. Glad to have you around. It's been a couple weeks. I know it has been a while. Let me hide all my crud. Well, that does not look better.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the
noticed
towered
that.
clarinet and the even more towered band who purveys assorted rhythms, all danceable.
Well, that
in the
does.
urban room of the Congress
Close
Hotel
enough.
in Chicago. And first of all,
Hey,
one of
Katie. Hey,
Irving
Gail.
Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Christine, the ways to send me money are right down here. Venmo, PayPal, or you can join, best of all, join Patreon. Which also gets you a discount on tours, etc. Hey, Gail. Hey, Diane. Hey, Mary. Yeah, well, the problem with this is the second button is too low. I gotta either button it all the way up or really be hanging it out like it's really the 70s over here. Hey, hey Mary, hey Tracy, hey Cindy, Stacy, Heather, Gladys. I need to scroll here. Hey Diane. Hey Bridget, hey Carol. Semper Fi Gary. Hey, Karen in Australia. Yeah, that's what I need is like a medallion right here. It looks a lot better, honestly, with the jacket, but it's really warm in here. We have not really gotten a storm. The sky was yellow a minute ago. It was really kind of cool. Hey, Tonya. There's also a Cash App Mysterious Chicago, if none of those is working. Looking like Dupree at the Thunderbird Cafe. Isn't that right, Miles? Look who's here, everybody. Here's Miles making his appearance. I just opened the window so I know right where he is. Hey, Bridget's mom. Karen, you're not the boss of me. I don't really like wearing jewelry much, honestly. I don't like all that stuff on me. Even the watch is kind of new for me. Hey, Dad. Put Miles right there. Hey, Mom. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome back. All right. Hey, Bella. Hey, Pepperana. Pepperana, Pepperana. Miles has just run now. And there goes Priya. Jeez. Right there. Gene, I did not watch the launch and explosion, but I was devastated to find out that he wasn't on board.
All my heart.
Hey, Aviva. Twitter took a real turn today. I mean, they took away actual verification badges today. And immediately, like, every post is like a huge list of blue check hillbillies who paid for it so they can spew transphobic crap. Or anti-Semitic crap, that's popular too. I got some of that yesterday. Hey, Donna. Yeah, you know, Kathy, I could go for that look. You know who else wears a lot of necklaces is Mr. T. I could totally go for the Mr. T look. I would definitely pull that off. Yeah, who's gonna watch that SpaceX explosion and think, I'm gonna buy a Tesla now? Definitely trust this guy with it. Would you buy a car from this man? Oh, nice, Christine. That's the problem with this one. Like, this first button is too low. It'll be good in the summertime when I'm really showing that joie de vivre. Saw it in the window, loved it. They didn't have my size at the H&M in New York, so I just ordered it. But had I tried it on, maybe not. Would I buy a Ford? Not from Henry, but he's dead. Evening, Katie. Twitter's still there, but we've all been kind of like holding our concerts out in Brooklyn to watch the island bridges blow for a while, Twitter-wise. Today it definitely took a turn. But I am drinking a Manhattan. I'm blowing the last of a debit card. I picked up some cherry bark vanilla bitters. I don't know if I can taste the cherry bark. Now, Twitter's been a big part of my professional life for 15 years now. And it's weird to see how it's turning into 4chan like overnight. Ah, John drinking a very far south side. A time travel pub call drink. Did you all get to see Marissa and Bill live when I went in to surprise them? In Manhattan? They used to play at a place in Hell's Kitchen, but they closed down, so now they're across the street at another place in Hell's Kitchen. Susan, this is an H&M job. Yeah, rapid unscheduled disassembly before stage separation. That's what I really liked watching in Star Wars when I was a kid, all the rapid unscheduled disassemblies. I also saw George Santos saying, well, Nick, once you get the bugs worked out, put me on the manned flight. Like, we get to shoot him into space? We'll send him cheesy movies, the worst we can find. Now, Jenny, only thing I bought in New York was a pair of shorts and a t-shirt because it was going to be so hot one day and I wasn't packed for that. Evening, Susan. Hey, everybody, we'll give Benny Goodman another song to go through here while people get logged on. Welcome along. I know it's been a couple of weeks. It really hasn't been that long since we got to broadcast, you know. But this kind of seems like it because I missed 1 week. A sudden arboreal stop. He's now suffering from ambulatory mortosis.
And they all loved it.
We're going to let Benny Goodman do one more tune for you here, coming to you live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago in 1936. Hey, Karen and Dexter. Hey, Susan, I really haven't made up my mind about this shirt. Loved it in the window, finally arrived today, and now I'm thinking, I don't know. It's not polyester, it kind of feels like polyester. Marie, yeah, you know, I tried having the West Wing pilot on in the house a few years ago, and Aiden and Warani were like, how do they not know what POTUS means? Forget these pre-Twitter days. Hello, Denise. It is a nice breathable shirt. It'll be good for those hot summer days. Oh, thank you, Mary. Marvelous. Did you also watch the live stream when we saw the marvelous Mrs. Maisel in person? We did all kinds of cool stuff in New York. I got a selfie with Janet from The Good Place. And this isn't actually polyester, it's some kind of fabric I've never heard of. But it feels like polyester. Letting Benny Goodman finish up this one more tune, then we will get started properly. Tencel, that's it, Timothy. Something like that, Polycell or Tencel. Some H&M business. Eric, well, she kind of seemed like Bad Janet in the play that I saw her in. April, that's alright. I'm undecided on the shirt myself. Looked great on a mannequin. Me, I am not a mannequin. Here we go.
Music by Benny Goodman is being
Presented from the Congress Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago, live in January of 1936. And welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out. I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time, so I am incredibly famous. And you know what? I finally got the advance for my Graceland Cemetery book that was supposed to come about 3 years ago. And I was all caught up on payments and everything, but now April has come, other royalties are supposed to come this time, so I'm back to the drawing board trying to get people who owe me $12 to pay me. That's publishing for you. Once again, author of such books as Mysterious Chicago, the book, Ghosts of Chicago, now a rare collector's item, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, they're almost paid up, Murder Maps USA, I don't think I earned out the advance on that one yet, so they're all good. And Graceland, the new one, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. Working on a couple of different ones right now. I did research for both while I was in New York the last couple of weeks. I went digging around in the microfilm room, looking up more stories from the New York coverage of Johann Hawk, one of our mustachioed serial killers, and also did a lot of work over at Trinity Cemetery. I solved a mystery yesterday. It was really awesome. But one thing I do in the course of research is now and then I notice that I'm just finding story after story in one stretch of road. Sometimes this leads to walking tours, like the Darker History of Taylor Street walking tour. This one I couldn't quite do in person because I could still probably find some more, but right now it stretches out just a little bit too far. It's a little bit more than I think people would be willing to walk. You usually figure maybe a mile over the course of an hour and a half. In this case, though, it goes just a little bit further than that. But Madison Street, the cuts right through the middle of the loop, has an awful lot of good stories, just over and over and over again. So we can do it virtually, where nobody's feet are going to hurt unless you're sitting in a really uncomfortable position. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the dark history of Madison Street. We'll start right here at Madison and Wabash. This is what that looked like back before they tore down this L-track station over here. But we're going to go back to 1921. There was a woman by the name of Jeanette Hoy who was living at the Eleanor Club. It was kind of hard for women to get apartments on their own in those days. Not as hard as it sometimes made out to have been on Twitter, but finding safe places where single women could live was a very difficult thing in the large city sometimes. So one place was the Eleanor Club that popped up. It was a place that specifically catered to single women. And here Jeanette Hoy met a friend who she wanted to be more than friends with. Now, this was 1921. Things like this had not become a political football yet. Most people didn't really have an opinion on stuff like this, didn't even really know what the name for it was. They were old enough and had been around enough that maybe they'd heard of such things, but it just wasn't something that people talked about at the time. So Jeanette became very enamored of her friend, her chum, as they called it in the papers, and made it very clear that she wanted to be more than friends. The friend was not very interested in that, so Jeanette came after her here on the L-track station, shot her, then ran down into a tobacco shop and shot herself as well. Neither of these were fatal. The woman whom she shot said, "Let's just forget the whole thing." Jeanette herself recovered nicely. The judge finally said, "Okay, if she's not pressing charges, we'll just say don't do it again." Trouble is, the same thing happened a few years later. After that point, the story takes a bit of a dark turn. Jeanette, in 1924, was sent to an asylum after a similar affair, and kind of disappears from the record after that. It's a sad state of affairs, and just a kind of a sad state of what the world was like in the 1920s. We're going to zip around a little bit from here. But we cover this kind of stuff quite a bit. A couple of years later, a trans woman named Frances Carrick was falsely accused of murder, very nearly beat the rap in court. Became kind of a media figure for a while, but they didn't even have a term for that sort of thing at the time. People just didn't really know. We're going to cross over State Street here, right around on Madison. You can see all the way through the loop now. The historic Walgreens, maybe it's historic, I don't know. But take a look at this thing right beside my picture here with all of the glass windows. This marks the site of McGuires Theater. Versions of the McGuires Theater were current from the 1850s all the way up to the 1970s, when they were primarily showing things like kung fu movies, I believe. But McVickers was run by the McVickers family. In the 1850s, their star was their daughter, little Mary McVicker. But she outgrew being a child star, quit the stage for a while until Edwin Booth, the most famous actor of the day, fell in love with her, persuaded her to play Juliet to his Romeo. Now, she ended up being buried here in Chicago. She's often on the Rose Hill Cemetery tours. The reviews she got for her debut as Juliet were bad, but she continued in her career with Edwin. In those days, Edwin Booth was such a famous actor that if he said this person's going to be in the play with me, everybody was just going to go with it. And he comes up on a lot of my tours. It's a weird little thing that Edwin Booth just kind of pops up a lot with me. In fact, there's a portrait of him on the wall at the understudy where I've been hanging out in mornings working on my projects. One time in New York, I mentioned a character that I talk about in the cemetery tours there and mentioned that they eventually gave his tooth to Edwin Booth. They thought he would give him some money for it. He just said, "Oh, thanks for the tooth." And now it has disappeared. One time I mentioned that, and a woman on the tour said, "Oh, I bet his horrible wife took it." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Oh, he was married to this horrible woman named Mary McVicker. My boyfriend and I role-play as them." I did not ask for further information. I dearly wish I had asked for further information. But Edwin and Mary did their debut together here at McGuires Theater. But just a few years before that, there had been a several-week engagement by Edwin's slightly less famous and more eccentric brother, John Wilkes Booth. Now here he is playing Macbeth. Now imagine this. This is 1862. The war has just started. Nobody knows what John Wilkes Booth's political affiliations are yet. Nobody's asking for things like that at the time. But just imagine about 3 years later, remembering John Wilkes Booth giving all of these speeches about plotting to assassinate somebody. If it was done, 'tis well 'twere done quickly. Now, Macbeth was also Abraham Lincoln's favorite show. John Wilkes Booth at this time told the Chicago Tribune that Macbeth was his favorite role. I should be saying the Scottish play, I know. But Lincoln also said that. He wrote in a book that nothing equaled that play. It is magnificent. And in fact, just days before his own assassination, he was on a riverboat and passed the time by reading out loud some passages, especially about King Duncan, the person that Mackers is plotting to assassinate. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps no more. Treason has done its worst, nor malice domestic, nor something, nothing can touch him further. And he read that over and over again. And this ended up being quoted at his funeral. It was, we're talking about some pretty high-level sources here. There's a lot of stories about that, about Lincoln, that have very shaky sources. In this case, that he had become obsessed with this line about an assassinated monarch. Resonated with people within days after the fact. But John Wilkes Booth played most of the major Shakespeare roles, or many of the major Shakespeare roles, plus a really melodramatic thing called The Apostate, over here at McVickers all throughout 1862. Lived over at the Tremont House Hotel, which comes up quite a bit. That's the one owned by James and Ira Couch, who still have a mausoleum over in Lincoln Park. And a family plot now at Rose Hill that comes up on the tours more often than not. Now, there's also a connection. The McVickers Building, you can see it wasn't just a theater. There were also things like a photographer in there in the 1890s, which gives it a bit of a connection to H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy. One of his victims, though this is the guy we tend to advertise as America's first known serial killer, one of his victims was a young woman named Emmeline Segrand. Now, she moved into his building in May of 1892, disappeared December of that same year, told a lot of her friends that she was engaged to somebody, including one friend who lived in the McVickers Building. Now, some years ago, I was on a TV show about Holmes. They came into possession of this shoebox full of documents that were supposed to be Holmes-related. There was a bit of Holmes paperwork in there, but then there were a whole bunch of photographs that didn't have any names attached to them or any apparent connection. One did, and it was the name of a guy in the Holmes saga, but it was a different gentleman of the same name. It's about all I can really say about it. I'm not really supposed to show this. But one thing that they did show me was this picture from the Stevens photography in the McVickers Building. Now, this does kind of look about right. There's not nearly enough data to know for sure. But Emmeline, we know, liked having her picture taken. She was a very dramatic young woman, always like writing lengthy inspirational quotes at the end of her letters. This looks like a pretty good match, and it's actually to a building that we can trace her to, which, as these things go, is better than we usually do anyway. Still not nearly enough evidence for sure, but there's not actually a photograph of her that survives, just a lot of newspaper drawings of her. It's one of the things that makes researching H.H. Holmes so interesting, is it happened in this one very narrow window of time, when newspapers had figured out how to do a lot more drawings, but hadn't quite gotten to photographs yet. If this had all taken place like 10 years later, we would have pictures of everybody. We would have lots more pictures of Holmes than we do. Instead, we mostly just have newspaper drawings of them. But let us move on a little bit. We're just going to go next block down. We come to the Chase Building. I always thought this was a really cool one, personally. Look, it goes swooping up and down. If you lean your back against it and look up, it looks really cool. Of course, it wasn't always there, and in 1928, there was another, department store building there. And in 1928, right on this stretch of Dearborn Street, Madison Street, just west of Dearborn, Tony Lombardo was assassinated. Now, Tony Lombardo was the head of the Unione Siciliana, which nominally was a Sicilian-American aid organization, but by 1928 was basically just a front for the mob. They controlled the Sicilian and Italian-American voting blocks. Whoever was the head of the Unione was pretty much the head of the mafia. Al Capone could not join because he was not Sicilian. But by then, even guys like John Torrio did not want to act, did not want to take out any high-profile people unless the Unione approved. So finally, by 1925, it got to be a very deadly job to have. Heads of the Union tended to be assassinated and replaced every couple of months, it seemed like. Tony Lombardo was a guy who was brought in, particularly to be a puppet of Al Capone. His plan was he was going to make it so non-Sicilians could become members and eventually make Al Capone the president, most likely. But the Capone guys had just gotten the North Side mad. Now, exactly what was motivating all of this is not entirely known, but Frankie Yale, Capone's mentor back in New York, who had recently switched sides to work for the Moran gang, had just been assassinated out in New York, so possibly in retaliation, the Northsiders killed Lombardo. And right in the possibly the most public hit they ever did. Normally they would not really shoot people right out where everybody could see them. This was a case they did it at one of the most busy intersections right at rush hour. What was happening was they were bringing an airplane into the building to work as a display, so everybody was looking up like, it's a plane! Like that guy, the second guy who saw Superman, who was really excited for some reason. So while everybody was looking up, a couple of gunmen came and shot Tony Lombardo down. This is actually a shot of the plane going into the building. What a cool shot that is. Wonder if they got it in better quality in their archive someplace. I shall have to ask. I know just who to ask. But there is Lombardo lying right there, and the bullets were saved. After this, they extracted the bullets and started saving them for forensic examination. Just how accurate these forensics were, tracing them back to the gun that shot them, is really, really shaky, I would think, personally. But according to their reasoning, it looked as though the same person who had killed him was the people who were involved in some other shootings as well. But it's one of those things we'll never really know for sure. Let's move on just a little bit more. We'll head down towards LaSalle Street, another block down. It's the dude in the hat. Just like back in the 1890s, it was always the guy with the mustache. So moving down here onto LaSalle Street, this used to be Newspaper Alley. This is how it looked like a while ago, when there was the Chicago Record, the morning version of the Chicago Daily News. And also, the Madhouse on Madison Street, the offices of the Chicago American. Now, the Chicago American was the newspaper that was started here by William Randolph Hearst. Now, the reputation Hearst has now is terrible. The yellow journalists who just made everything up. I read a lot of Hearst papers, and I read a lot of other papers from the era in those days. I really find that the Hearst papers are no less reliable than anything else. They just took a lot of drubbing for stylistic purposes more than anything else. They were having big screaming headlines. They were having pictures, well, more pictures before most other people did. A lot of the reputation just comes from smear campaigns of the other newspapers, who generally weren't writing nearly as detailed or as fun to read stories. But when Hearst decided he was going to move into Chicago, he was only operating 2 papers in 1900. He had one in New York and one in San Francisco. Told one of his guys, I think it's time that we open in Chicago. You think you can get a paper launched in 6 weeks? That was an absurd proposition, but the guy said, well, we're going to have to shoot our way in. To which Hearst replied, we'll take all the ammunition you need. And he meant that entirely literally, because a couple of the bigger newspapers at the time were employing what they called newspaper sluggers. Now, back behind these buildings in an alley was Newsy's Alley. These were places where they opened up into back rooms where newsboys could sleep. A lot of these kids were homeless and just kind of self-sufficient, selling newspapers. Now, this was probably the most diverse group of kids in the Chicagoland area at the time. They came from all races and all classes. More of them were poor than not. They all had nicknames, most of which were horribly insulting and problematic. But in those days, they didn't really think about that kind of stuff. These were highly unsupervised children. They were only going to be so polite. But newspapers were hiring some of these guys to work as what they called sluggers. Their job was to go and make sure that this paper had the right corner for their newsboys to stand on, that this cart or that cart was prominently displaying certain papers only under penalty of fists. And in fact, according to some people who were involved in this, over the course of the years, about 27 people were killed over the course of the 1900s and 1910s. Now, these also became kind of like farm teams for the mobs in Chicago. Dean O'Banion, who would go on to be the head of the North Side Mob, is generally said to have been a newspaper slugger. I can't find anything to totally back that up, but it was said fairly soon after his death. It's not like something somebody just made up in the 1970s. And we do know that there was this whole Newsy riot. Shortly after that, the law grabbed another newspaper slugger, Spike O'Donnell. Also, Mossy Enright was part of this crowd. So these are a couple of big gangsters from a generation later who got their start here. There's Spike O'Donnell, who operated kind of outside of the system. I believe he nominally worked for Capone off and on. Not to be confused with Klondike O'Donnell. There were a couple of them. But this was Mo Annenberg, the guy who was in charge of all of these guys. Later, he bought the Philadelphia Inquirer and was sentenced to jail for tax fraud by the same judge who was sentenced to Al Capone for tax fraud. But that wasn't the only thing going on in Newsy's Alley, where all of these kids hung out to enjoy gambling, which is most of what they did was gambling. But it was also the entrance to the Whitechapel Club. Now, this was a press club in the 1890s, at a time when these guys were kind of ahead of their time by not having mustaches in the 1890s. But this was basically a press club. They could also have like one member from each profession, like one banker, one railroad man, etc. But these were guys who would hang around here, people who worked the crime beat and had to have kind of a dark sense of humor. They would open the meetings by dipping their fingers in the ashes of a member who had died and been cremated out on the Indiana dunes. This is a couple of years before there was actually a crematory in Chicago. In the club, they had actual skeletons, they had medical devices, they had relics from actual murders, they had murder weapons, they had nooses that had been used in execution, and here they would drink out of skulls. Most of what they did there was drink and sing drinking songs. Fly as a bird to the mountain, you who are weary of sin. And something, stand to your glasses steady, a toast to your comrades' eyes. Here's to the ones dead already, and hurrah for the next who dies. Those kinds of dark drinking songs. I should really get the Dead Ringers to put together a version of that. Of course, we've been to the Whitechapel Club on our virtual time travel pub crawls several times now. They make the best punch. Let's move down the block just a little bit here. We'll leave our goths behind. And just head down to Wells Street, the next one you would come to, and go back in time a good 35 years or so, back to 1857. Now, right about here, up at Madison and Wells, a man by the name of Thompson was stopping in town along with his 16-year-old apprentice, a young black man named Samuel Gantz. Now, he had been living with Mr. Thompson as an apprentice since he was 2, but he was free. They were from Pennsylvania, but rumors went around that young Samuel was being taken down south to be brought into slavery. So, as the rumors went around that a crowd started to gather outside of the hotel here where Samuel and Thompson were holed up, they brought in Alan Pinkerton, who had come to Chicago specifically to work on the Underground Railroad. And that was still a lot of what he was doing in the 1850s. So he went and investigated and determined, no, this kid's free. He's going to remain free. There's no charge of anything like that. But once people saw that Alan Pinkerton was there, they realized, that does it. If he's involved in this case, it must be a slavery case. And so a riot ensued. So this riot ensued attempting to free Sam Gantz. Eventually, they had to hop into the wagon and try to drive away. It broke down around here at Madison and Wells. Pinkerton, Thompson, and Gantz were all in charge with inciting a riot. But really, that was just to get them squared away for a while, get them put in a jail cell, really just long enough for things to cool down, at which point everyone was able to go. Gantz came out and gave a good talk and quieted them down a little bit, but the charges for inspiring a riot were all stopped. But this is what the Chicago Tribune said. We cannot blame the colored men of this city for the jealousy with which they watch anything that looks like an attempt to take one of their color back to slavery, that bitter, crushing, terrible slavery which so many of them have suffered. Now, Chicago at the time, there were what they called the black laws in the state of Illinois. There were lots of restrictions, but Chicagoans tended to pat themselves on their back, probably a lot more than they should have, about the fact that they weren't really enforced in Chicago. Chicago was something of a sanctuary city. They could still get a guy like Henry Rhines who would try to arrest people every now and then, but when that happened, riots like this happened. You also notice that it says cruising instead of crushing. I think that might be why I put this other thing in the paper that I saw. Now and then you find some really entertaining typos in the Chicago Tribune. When the mother went away, Manny was forced to shit for herself. Poor Minnie's mother before that. But just next door to this, really, just the next block down, there was a building in 1901 called the Galbraith Building. It looked like this. It went up about 5 stories. It was just really an office building plus a couple of shops. Shops on the first floor, offices up above that. but it was topped by a brand new 80-ton water tank. Now, you still see those water towers on top of buildings. They serve different purposes in different cities. In New York, it's because you need that for the water pressure if you have your building over 5 or 6 stories. In Chicago, they were here for fire prevention. So this 80-ton tank on there, the construction workers had told them, you should really be spreading this out a little bit more. You need 2 medium-sized water tanks, not this one really big one. This is way too heavy for this. But the people in charge of the building said, oh, bah. Perhaps they said, oh, poo. Something like that. And so, April of 1901, one day there were some really high winds blowing. This water tank crashed through the ceiling. Then it crashed through the 5th floor. Then it crashed through the 4th floor, the 3rd floor, the 2nd floor, and all the way down into the basement. Now, there were 450 workers inside of the building, 100 of whom were right in the path of this giant falling water tank. Miraculously, nobody was killed, and in fact, only 4 of them were injured. There was a bootblack in the entryway who was knocked all the way down into the basement, got bruised up pretty badly, but it was said that he would recover just fine. There was also a woman who was operating a bird shop down on the 1st floor of the building someplace. She was blown behind her counter by the rubble and then buried under the rubble, but she was taken home with a bruised shoulder. They're really kind of remarkable that more people didn't get hurt by something like this. It's also kind of remarkable that there is a photograph of it. It's one of the great things about Hearst newspapers is they provide us with a lot of photographs that would otherwise, of places that would otherwise be totally lost. Did they have farmers? I don't know. Maybe they called up Liberty Mutual and got only the coverage they needed and figured, we don't need water tank coverage. I could see this one. Birds, I never heard if the birds were okay. The paper didn't cover that. Probably we don't want to know. Let's move down just a bit more. A building that may in fact be cursed. Cursed with bad ghost stories, anyway. This is the Civic Opera Building, 1930, by Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. Essentially a Beaux-Arts style building built over an Art Deco frame. Casey's correct. Unscheduled multi-floor descent. So this is the other side of it. This was built for a guy named Samuel Insull, a utilities kingpin. He knew that operas normally did not make money. He'd been involved in the opera for a long time, but reasoned that if they got a bigger opera house, they could, especially if they added these 2 towers on the side whose rent money would help keep the opera afloat. Normally, at the auditorium, even if they sold every ticket, the operas did not make money. But this led to a building that looked kind of like a throne. There's a legend saying that Insull said, when I die, I will come back and sit on that throne. Also, a lot of weird stories about this was him turning his back on New York because they had turned down his wife as an opera singer. His wife never attempted to be an opera singer. People who think that his girlfriend did are confusing him with Harold Fowler McCormick. You're getting like the wrong part of Citizen Kane here. So, in any case, this place was built in 1929, opened in November of that year, but really seems to have been kind of cursed. It opened 3 weeks after the stock market crash that kicked off the Great Depression. Now, the effect of that wasn't felt entirely right away. They still did pretty well early on, but the Depression was not a good time to be running operas. They started bringing in things like Duke Ellington. There's a terrific Duke Ellington bootleg here with Django Reinhardt opening. Another bit of a video here. I'll just show a little bit of this more up close. But the building already kind of seemed as though it had been cursed by then, because in the process of construction, a few people had died. There was a construction worker who fell off, and then right before they opened, there was another one. A Chicago manufacturer killed himself on the inside. And then in 1929, shortly before they opened, there was a daredevil who decided to climb up the thing, one of those human fly type guys. Climbed all the way up and then fell. His name was Rudy Caminetti. There's actually, not only did he fall and die, he also landed on somebody and killed them as well. But remarkably, there's actually some footage of him on a Magnificent Mile skyscraper around the same time. This is a silent film from about that same era, 1928, 1929. Here you can see he's up on, I would say this is maybe the Palm Olive building. Climbing up on... he's okay that time. He may be never down, but never out. When he falls down, he gets back up again. This time, anyway. Becky, we do not need no stinking badges. Oh, Rudy, Rudy, Rudy. Yeah. So what they don't really show is he's probably got a full ledge right next to him there. But unfortunately, he wasn't quite so lucky when he tried to do the same thing at the new Civic Opera building, which is now cursed with some easily debunked urban legends that turn up on boat tours a lot, and also some really unoriginal ghost stories. Well, let's look right across the river from it is the Chicago Daily News building, which is covered for architectural purposes. It's like an Art Deco version of the Sphinx. Also has a public plaza with people like Mr. Pulitzer and Mr. Medill, who would run the rival paper, the Chicago Daily News, and Benjamin Franklin. There's kind of like a whole history of printing here. Incidentally, this fresco here, that is not what Joseph Medill looked like. It does kind of look like his granddaughter, Sissy Patterson. Come to think of it. I don't know really what they're doing here. No, not included here is the guy who ran the Chicago Times in the same era, Wilbur Story. You and all what we think of Wilbur Story around here. Let's move one down. Now we're across the river. Off in the distance, you can see the Chicago Bat. The real Chicago Bat. We'll kind of take a look at what this looked like in the 1960s. At the time, in the background there, you can see the Chicago Opera, the Opera House that we just saw, but back when it was an insurance building. But right around here on Clinton Street, there used to be a place called the Galt Hotel. Now, in 1891, a couple of blocks away from this, there was a guy by the name of George Painter living with his girlfriend, Alice Martin, not his wife. Still illegal in Michigan, apparently. I just found that out today. He didn't work, spent most of his time drinking Alice's money away. He was known to be not the nicest guy, but one day he came home and found out that Alice was dead. She had been beaten to death. She was also having an affair with another guy named Dick Edwards, who was no better than George was. So he went running around saying, "Are all you people dead? My Alice has been murdered." He said that he had been at Schiller's Saloon, which was back at Madison and Canal, a couple of blocks back from here. Meanwhile, a couple of people said they saw another guy come into the Galt Hotel and say that he just trimmed a woman over on Green Street. Now, he was all covered in blood. When they found it, when George was running around, he did not have any bloodstains on him, which was a little bit suspicious, which is part of why the trial lasted for so very long. Painter's trial was dragged out quite a bit. He kept getting stays of execution after stays of execution. Finally, he was brought up on the scaffold and said something to the effect of, "May God damn me to hell if I was guilty." But then the rope broke and he landed on his head. They were pretty sure he was already dead, but the sentence said he must hang by the neck until he was dead, so by God, they were going to hang him by his neck until he was dead. They hauled him back up, tied the rope around him, slid him down the trap door just to make sure. If I killed Alice Martin, the girl I dearly loved, the woman I loved so much I would commit almost any crime for her, I pray this minute, my last minute on earth, the eternal God will put me into eternal hell. 1914, another guy confessed to having done the killing. Whether this guy was telling the truth or not is a whole other matter, but for a long time, Painter's case was held up as a case in which Chicago hanged the wrong man. It's probably not the best example they could take. You might remember a few months ago we did a whole virtual tour on times when there's a very good chance that they hanged the wrong man, and frankly, I think this entire era, from like the 1890s through at least the 1920s, the police and the coroner were just so corrupt that every sentence probably should have been vacated. It was that bad. But like when Sam Cardinello was facing the gallows on charges that were also a little bit trumped up, George Painter came up. The lawyer brought him up as an example of a guy who had a time that the Chicago had hanged the wrong man. Casey wonders if the hangman got paid twice. There's some difference of opinion on whether we actually had a hangman or not. You can see the little box behind the scaffold that was supposed to hold the hangman. Though by some accounts, really that was just a blind. It was really the sheriff who was doing everything. We'll move up here to Madison Street now. which by 1960 looked like this. It was known as Skid Row for a long time here. And also in 1915, lower down, there was quite the riot in this spot. There were jobless workers went marching on this place, with signs saying things like, "Give us this day our daily bread," marching for jobs, marching for food. A pastor was very happily arrested. And also Lucy Parsons, one of the widows of the Haymarket anarchists, ended up going to jail for this. Mary Wilmarth came along and bailed everybody out. Jane Addams concluded that it was... Jane Addams of Hull House said that it was a peaceful protest. People were just walking up, but then the police decided they wanted some glory, so they started beating everybody up. The priest who was present said exactly the same thing. The cop said the cops were wild beasts, and they started the riot just so they could have the glory of stopping it. Now, Mary Wilmarth, Chicago socialite, came and bailed everybody out. A couple of weeks later, the radical people started showing up at Hull House, wanting the things to get a little bit rougher. At that point, they decided Jane Addams was a sellout because she didn't want to get rougher. They were known to do that in the anarchist community, so it was one of those communities where you could be accused of being a sellout real easy. Also, there were all these terrific quotes. "The real IWW, the Wobblies of Chicago, are the police. They are engaged in the business of manufacturing crime so they can have the glory of stamping it out. When the city of Chicago authorizes wild beasts to slug hungry men publicly displaying the words of the Lord's Prayer, the city, I say, has declared itself to be anti-Christian, atheistic, and anarchistic." I would amend that quote a little bit nowadays. And Jane Addams had all kinds of things to say about the police after this. And Wilmarth herself occasionally comes up on the Graceland Cemetery tour. She's in the book. Well, not right now. It's too close to the construction right now. But this section of Halstead Street was also where Carl Wanderer first met the Drifter. And I've covered the story of Carl Wanderer many, many times on here. He's on the Ghost Tour and several others, so I'll kind of leave it alone now. Suffice it to say, he shot his wife to death, also shot a Drifter to death, and tried to blame the whole thing on the Drifter. Detective Sergeant John W. Norton, 25 years after he investigated H.H. Holmes, kind of acted the Columbo rule, saying, "I'm so sorry, Carl. We see that it's such a tragedy that you lost your wife in such a manner, but there's just one thing I don't understand. How come you and the Drifter had the same model of gun?" Let's move down a little bit more. By Jet's Pizza, my wife's favorite. But right about here, where the scary Nails place was, I say scary because look at this shot. Ah! I know she's going to claw me with those things. But this was the site of a place called the Hub back in the 1870s. Now, the Hub was a bar that catered primarily to counterfeiters, but was also popular with grave robbers. It was operated by a guy by the name of Terrence Mullins, who looked exactly like I hoped that he would. And it was under his watchful eye that one of the counterfeiters was arrested and taken to jail. His buddies sat around in the Hub thinking about how can we get him out of jail, when somebody approached them and said, "Boys, I know just what to do. I am the boss of every grave robber in Chicago. Here's what I propose. We'll go down to Springfield and steal the body of old man Lincoln. Then we'll hold that body for ransom, get your friend out of jail, and get lots of money, like $10,000 each." So they organized a posse. At the time, Lincoln's coffin was just inside of a white marble sarcophagus right in the middle of the room. It would never be again after this. But they managed to get the coffin about halfway out of the sarcophagus when somebody in their posse gave the signal. One of their posse was also working for the feds, so the feds at this point swooped in and charged these guys with the attempted theft of a $75 coffin. They got in a lot more legal trouble than you normally would for stealing a $75 anything, but that was really, legally, that was all they could be charged with at the time. Now we're going a little overtime tonight. I hope you guys don't mind. You usually don't. We'll proceed up a little ways here. A little way further down at 1118, was the site of the Hobo College. The Hobo College looked like this on the outside. You can see it looked kind of similar, really, to what it does now. Only different cars. But the Hobo College was a place operated by Benjamin Reitman, who was a big birth control advocate at the time, also accused of being a sellout because he bought a car. But here he operated a Hobo College, where they could just come and have a bowl of soup, exchange information about which trains were the easiest to hop, learn to make mulligan stew, also learn about things like Shakespeare and finance. Also, you can see they had checkerboards, pinochle decks, crossword puzzles, all available here, things to exercise their minds. A frequent lecturer there was Emma Goldman, who was Ben Reitman's non-exclusive off-and-on girlfriend. Here's Reitman himself. And this guy kind of maintained, this neighborhood really kind of maintained that same flavor as being the place where the hobos might hang out all the way up to the 1960s, 1970s. Now, one person who was there in the 1970s said it was like a neighborhood populated entirely by alcoholic men. Here is our friend Scott and his wife portraying Ben and Emma at a Hobo College recreation. Here's Emma Goldman's grave out at Forest Home Cemetery in the Radical section near the Haymarket Monument. Sophie B. Hawkins used to introduce her cover of Dylan's I Want You by saying, "My name is Emma Goldman. This is a song I wrote in jail. It is 1934 at Christmas time, and it's cold and it's snowing, and I'm singing this with my Salvation Army band." None of which is remotely true, obviously, but it is exactly what I picture when I hear that song. There's a work and wash, advice to beaus by ex-anarchist. Dr. Ben Reitman told them to get a job and wash up a little bit. Reasonable advice. But this from a sellout who owned a car. So move just down the block a little ways to the 1200 block. I haven't checked what's there right now. Things change in a few years. It was about 3 years ago that I got this footage. Hobo College thong. Yeah, I would love that. But here where the children get haircuts now, at the children's haircut place, was once the office of Dr. Thomas Neal Cream. Now, Dr. Thomas Neal Cream is one of our pre-H.H. Holmes serial killers here, who was first arrested after a patient died on the table. He had a patient on whom he was performing an abortion who died. He was brought in but eventually cleared, not before the Chicago Times had published articles with headlines like, "Cream, a Tartar." I'll just kind of stare at the screen for a second there. But he was eventually jailed, then sent back home to the UK, where he got involved in continuing to perform abortions, then giving the young women who got them painkillers that were laced with way too much strychnine. And that was actually a case here that nobody connected him with at the time. This is one of my favorite finds. I mean, the footnote of the new book about the guy. There was a woman named Alice Montgomery just across the street from here in a boarding house. After dinner, she excused herself to the ladies' private closet and was found screaming and doubled over on the floor. Turned out that she had undergone an abortion and then taken painkillers that were laced with way too much poison. Now, there was a whole investigation. For some reason, nobody connected it to Dr. Cream, even though his office was right there, right next to it. This method of execution was not really known to him at the time. It was shortly after the Alice Montgomery case that he finally was arrested. He had a girlfriend out in Garden Prairie who was married to a guy named Daniel. He ordered her to poison Daniel. So now out in Garden Prairie, there is this gravestone. Daniel Stott, poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream. It's very rare that you see a murder mystery carved right onto a gravestone like that. There's also a Masonic logo up at the top that you can't really see anymore. And I am going way over time today, so we're just going to skip ahead a little bit. And Jenny, you know what? This is very similar to the cover of my novel, Just Kill Me. The publishers who put together that cover had no idea of that. I thought it was fascinating. We'll also go just down the ways a little bit here to what is now Madison and Roby, where the stadium is. But right around here in 1900, there was a place called the Roby Tavern, not to be confused with the Roby House, the Frank Lloyd Wright building. But this was an old tavern that at the turn of the 20th century was said to be haunted by a black-robed ghost, a woman who walked around going like this, their hands folded like a classic ghost. It was said that she was a ghost who had haunted the place ever since the first hanging was held in the city right here. Which, of course, is not quite right. Now, there was a hanging down on the south side in the 1840s. In the 1850s, there were a couple of public executions a few blocks away from this, but not right where this was. Of course, at the time, it was kind of the middle of nowhere, so one can at least understand how people could mix it up. You know, we're going to backtrack just a little bit. I'm going to throw this one in here, too. Back in the 1700 block, a couple of blocks east of where we just were, there was a bar called the Bucket of Blood, where gangsters beat up a patrolman back in 1917. But this was a place known as sometimes as the Madhouse Cabaret, sometimes as the Bucket of Blood. It was a very noisy tavern operating right under the nose of Prohibition, sometimes called the Madhouse Cabaret at 1801. Now, officially in 1924, it was a coffee house. But don't you believe it, operated by Jim Murphy, a former prize fighter, and now operating one of the most dangerous espresso bars in town. But this figured into the murder of a guy named John Duffy, who had been brought in by the O'Banion gang to be their hitman, bragged a lot about how much killing he did, but then never actually did it. So they took him on what was thought to be the first one-way ride. After his body was found, they questioned Jimmy Murphy, who once was the owner of the Bucket of Blood, dealt in booze, women, and guns all his life, believed to have been in the murder crew and missing ever since. And we'll scroll up to one of the other suspects. Al Brown, really Al Capone, manager of the Four Deuces, the most despicable resort ever kept anywhere, located at 2222 Wabash, and always cheating between raids. Known as a procurer all his life, used his revolver frequently, women often informed the police to serve his own purposes, took up booze as a means of getting pocket money into the vice profession when the vice profession was dull. He was under the wing of Torrio, worked with O'Banion, Miller, or anyone else who could show him the way to ill-gotten gains, said to have been among those present when Duffy started on his journey of death. Now, they did have Duffy meet them outside of the Four Deuces Club, so it would look like maybe Capone did it. That was just part of the plan. I believe it was actually this case where Capone was quoted as saying, "I'm just a businessman, and for no reason at all, everybody's always trying to mix me up with something." But it was almost certainly O'Banion who ordered this one. And once again, the bullets were saved. But all right, I have gone well over what I normally do, but hey, it's been a little while. So let me just quick plug, this weekend we do have a live in-person tour, and of course, I haven't decided what we're doing next Thursday, but we will do something next Thursday night. I will be in town. But this Sunday morning at 11 a.m., it'll be an in-person tour at Rose Hill Cemetery. Go to Adam Chicago or MysteriousChicago.com. That'll get you all of the information you need on tickets. If you are on the Patreon, there's a tier for free tickets, or on all of the tiers, you do get a discount. So lots of stuff coming up. There is always stuff coming up here at Mysterious Chicago. And with that, I will just let's put up the one with all of the options here. And thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. Here's Benny Goodman back again. And Al Capone, why is everybody always picking on me? Thank you, Barry. I do that sounds like a dog. Hey, Heather. Thank you, Karen. Can we see Miles again? Where did Miles go? Miles is on the couch right now. I'll bring the camera over there in a minute. Priya is presently hanging in the window next to the keyboard where I'm working on a demo for the next great Broadway showstopper, I assure you. I can only tell you the title if it were the After Hours tour, but oh, it's catchy. Thanks, Ava. Eleanor, yeah, I had 3 flights home canceled out of 5, I guess. Am I planning a walking tour May the 20th of May? Probably, yeah. Send me a note if you have a request for a specific one. Updates for the mysterious Chicago dinners? Not yet, but we got a couple of good leads. I really think the understudy would be absolutely perfect for Wind Blew In. Down to the cherry in my Manhattan. It is about time for an after-hours tour, isn't it? We're working on a really interesting story in Trinity Church in New York. There's a woman buried under the steeple, nobility, whose husband was widely reported at the time to be really into dressing in women's clothes. Mostly to shock people, more than anything else from what I can see. There's even stories that he showed up in a dress for his wife's funeral at Trinity. Though some of this is Herbert Asbury stuff. But no, there are stuff from the early 1700s talking about him displaying himself in women's clothing. But that's not necessarily after hours. This ain't Florida. Yeah, speaking of, I took a group of kids to see Some Like It Hot on Broadway, the new musical version, which is fantastic. Everybody around me was just elated by it. But it would be illegal to put that on in Florida right now. For me taking kids there, I'd be a fugitive from justice. Fascist state of Florida. Thanks to those of you hitting me up on Venmo. I'm getting alerts on my watch now. This is new. Oh yeah, there are some new people out there. There's a group out there on Facebook called the Mysterious Chicago Regulars and Miles Fan Club. Miles, of course, is the cat over there blending in with the couch right now. You know, today would have been such a good day for a walking tour. Except for the fact that it looked like it might rain any second. I walked outside for a bit just to look at the yellow sky. It felt so good outside today. Perfect tour weather other than the threat of rain and tornadoes. Which tends to happen every time I do Dark History of Taylor Street. I was just thinking we didn't really do that one last year. I should really bring that one back. But every time it's either like blazingly hot or horribly rainy, etc.
They're all trucking, and here's Helen Ward to tell you all about her. Trucking.
Yeah, Cruz, we had a tornado watch up here today, too. Up here on the north side. Now, Taylor Street is another version of this, like Darker History on Madison Street. Taylor Street is one where it all is just tight enough that I can do it as a walking tour. And Hull House might even get involved in it now. Hull House is much more open right now to their urban legends and ghost stories than they used to be. I might even be working with them in October. I know I'm going to be down in Springfield for the Illinois History Conference. They asked me to be on a panel. That'll be the weekend after Mysiricon. This will be last weekend in September, moving into October. Joanne Mario's, yes, they should be open again by now. Oh yeah, a sweatshirt that just says Hobo College. Like that one from Animal House. I finally saw Animal House just recently. It's an example I can hold up is that comedy is very based in the time it is. You know, like for a long time, if you asked 5 people what the funniest book ever was, at least 3 probably would have said the Pickwick Papers. You read it now, it's pretty funny. And same thing now, Animal House is still very funny, but you look at reviews of it from the 1970s, people act like it was the funniest thing in decades. All over town. Donna, I'd be afraid to watch the TikTok ghost hunter doing a tour of Hull House. There's just so many urban legends about that place. Yeah, Susan, roll your eyes now. I'm young. My generation was more into Revenge of the Nerds, which really, really does not hold up. Well, with a lot of comedy, you just had to be there. Remarkably, Some Like It Hot is still absolutely hilarious. Laura, glad to hear that. Phoenix, sorry to hear about the pneumonia. Feel better.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
The Bee's Knees, the Bees and E's, the Be All and End All. I read a while ago that the Bee's Knees was supposed to be the B's and E's, the Be All and End All. I don't know if that was true. Sounds like one of those folk etymologies, which are very popular, of course. It's a classic tour guide trick, and that's where we get the phrase, it's never true. Yeah, I'm not saying Animal House isn't funny. It's just it's hard to imagine why people thought it was the funniest thing in a million years when it came out. But it was nice to find out where all those quotes were. Drop and give me 20. You're all worthless and weak. Which I know from Twisted Sister. Now, Airplane still holds up. Airplane, I think, is just as funny now as it was then. But it's a very classic kind of humor, too. It's like Boy Scout skit humor. Yeah, that's actually a line I bring up now and then when people are saying, well, my generation, Gen X, we don't get offended like these kids do. Like, yeah, Animal House is just okay. Watch them get offended. But yeah, I'm sure it was at the time. You know, Richard Pryor's The Toy does not hold up. Also, Revenge of the Nerds, we rented that so many times in my generation. Very important movie to my generation. Really, really does not hold up. But you can never tell what comedy is going to hold up, because so much comedy is just a reaction to the times. Like, Pickwick Papers is still funny, but I feel like you had to be there. Catherine Evans, who was in Our American Cousin at the Forge Theater and is now at Rose Hill Cemetery, said audiences today probably wouldn't think it was funny at all. That was in like the 1920s, early 20s. Casey, the Pickwick Papers isn't about anything. They just wander around drinking for 800 pages. And that's what Christmas is all about, Charlie Brown. Yeah, the Mel Brooks stuff tends to hold up. I don't know if it's as funny now. He had a great line. Somebody told him the producers was vulgar, and he said, "Madam, it rose below vulgarity." Which is also probably what I'll say about this musical I'm working on right now. Which I think will open with a song by The Limited Time, my other band. And I got a great song written for it already that I'm very excited about. Problem is, it shouldn't be someone like me singing. It's supposed to be like a 10 or 11-year-old girl singing it. Friday evening, July 12th? Quite possibly. But I haven't really planned to head that far yet. I work on my own schedule. If Phoenix, there's a Groucho Marx interview I found. He's talking about the week he would spend in Hollywood. On Monday, I go looking for Hedy Lamarr. On Thursday, I go this and this. What about Monday and Tuesday? I found Hedy Lamarr. It's very clever. You wouldn't make that joke nowadays. Sunday, April 30th. Haven't planned one yet, but we'll see. Carol, I think Caddyshack has gotten better with age. Partly because of Rodney Dangerfield.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
Caddyshack, as I understand it, at the time was considered a very disappointing follow-up to Animal House, but now people like it. Partly, I think, because of Rodney Dangerfield, more so than Chevy Chase. Dangerfield's Back to School holds up remarkably well, all things considered. His speech on business can teach you a lot. And plot-wise, it's totally forgettable. Oh, Bill Murray in Caddyshack too, for sure. This unbuttoned shirt is definitely an interesting choice for me tonight. All right, let's go see Miles. About time to make this smaller. We'll go see Miles. It's a sick Fisher on the wall. Sick Fisher's real. The Hopper is not. That should be no surprise. Look who's over here. Miles. Oh, Miles. Oh, now he leaves, of course. You had to get your cameo in here, Miles. People expect to see you. And all of my laundry over here. A rare look at my laundry. Can I find more silent movies? Yeah, ones that are filmed in Chicago are in pretty short supply. And honestly, that's not a virtual tour that ever makes me much money. Even when, during the height of lockdown, when people were donating these things a lot more than they do now. Come on, Miles. We're okay with doing this. Oof. Yeah.
And here's a short encore portion.
Say hi to the nice people.
Invitation at the beginning of his program. Let's dance.
Okay, my little TikTok kitty. You don't usually do it, but let's try it out. Tick-tock, 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 tick-tock. Nah, he doesn't want TikTok kitty. Remember when he used to do airplane rides? He He tried to get into a bag the other day. I remember he used to do airplane rides a lot, where you get in a bag and I just swing him and swing him. He loved it. Then he got too big for that. But all right, that is Benny wrapping up, so I think it is time that I plug one more time. You want to do something like this in person? Come on out on Sunday morning, Rose Hill Cemetery. Tickets at Mysterious Chicago or AdamChicago.com. Still a few tickets left to go. Not too many, but a few left to go. But all right, everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. We'll be back tomorrow morning with Find a Grave Friday for the first time in a couple of weeks. I will talk to you all soon, and until then, I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tour saying to stay safe and stay strong. And of course, ladies and gents, and those beyond the binary, stay spooky.